I'm muted. It's first time. Hello, bonjour, okay. Welcome to everyone, and welcome to Nonprofits at 2. I am Karen Ball, President and CEO of CCVO. I want to start by recognizing and honoring the impact and difference that all of you who work in the nonprofit sector have had on our communities over this past year. I'm struck by how many stories I hear daily coming out of the sector about the impact of your work and what it is having on our communities. Stories from Prospect and Momentum, who are seeing steady growth in client employment, and the Propeller Volunteer Connector, who has seen over 2 million volunteers connect to meaningful opportunities across Alberta. These are the stories of relief, resilience, and recovery that we will continue to lift up and tell together. So thank you. I also want to honor and acknowledge the land where CCVO is fortunate to call home, the traditional Treaty 7 territory, home of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, the Nakota Nations, and Métis Nation Region 3, who have built prosperous communities on these lands for centuries. Today's gathering is presented by ATB Financial and is produced in partnership with our friends at the Mount Royal Institute for Community Prosperity. This series is supported by the Matart Foundation, PwC Canada, and our media partner, Post Media, and our core supporters that make it possible for CCVO to strengthen our nonprofit networks and advocate for the needs of our sector every day. A few points about today's gathering. During the panel discussion that takes place over the first half of this session, you'll be able to submit questions for the live question and answer portion that takes place in the second half. At the end of the event, you'll also have a chance to answer a few short questions about your experience today. We hope you'll take time to complete the short survey and share your thoughts with us so that we can ensure that Nonprofits at 2 remains relevant and responsive to your interests and needs. And we are responding to your needs by making Nonprofits at 2 an hour instead of an hour and a half moving forward, so you can make the most of your busy days. And now on to the main event. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's fantastic panel, who I will now ask to join me on screen, starting with our moderator. James Stotch, Director at Mount Royal University's Institute for Community Prosperity. In addition to his role at the Institute, James serves on the board of the Alberta Eco Trust as an advisor to the Metcalfe Foundation and to the Nonprofit Resiliency Lab, and is on the editorial board of The Philanthropist. If you haven't seen it yet, I recommend reading James's recent annual scan of trends and emerging issues in the nonprofit sector titled Unmasking the Future. It's fantastic, produced in partnership with the Calgary Foundation. Welcome, James. Angela Clark, Chief Strategy Officer at Trellis. Angela has worked in the nonprofit sector delivering agency strategy for over a dozen years and holds an executive MBA from the University of Fredericton and a BA in Developmental Studies from our U of C. Welcome, Angela. Aiden Athwal, Vice Chair, Making Changes, and prior Chair at Dress for Success, Calgary. Aiden is a corporate social responsibility professional with Benevity, a finance and accounting consultant, and mom to a growing family, recently growing family. She holds an MBA from our U of C and is a chartered accountant. Welcome, Aiden. Sarah Bateman, Director of Community Investment and Impact at Calgary Arts Development. Sarah has 15 years of experience in corporate community investment, evaluation, and social innovation, and is a graduate of the Social Innovation Graduate Program at the University of Waterloo. Welcome, Sarah. And last but by no means least, Sarah Wonky, Executive Director at Social Venture Partners. In addition to her role at SVP, Sarah is also a director on the Field of Crosses Memorial Project and recently finished her term as board chair of the Calgary Military Family Resource Center. She has completed postgraduate programs in public relations and communication, nonprofit management, and healthcare management. Welcome to you all. I will now turn the reins over to James to dive in on today's lively session. Take it away, James.
Thank you, Karen, and CCVO for hosting this important and timely discussion. So Volunteer Alberta recently undertook a challenge dialogue process, which was a deep, months-long consultation with social impact organizations around Alberta. It revealed that the pandemic provides an opportunity to profoundly transform the sector, making the case that now is the time, this is a quote, now is the time that social profit organizations conduct a review of their relevancy and entertain different ways to serve the sector, which may include expansions, mergers, collaborations, and closures. The Premier's Council on Charities and Civil Society has also raised the specter of amalgamation, as have sector capacity builders and funders. The Muttart Foundation, for example, a longtime sector champion, has announced their interest in helping finance mergers and devoted a chapter to mergers in their new Restructuring and Insolvency Guidebook. So the Institute for Community Prosperity is interested in big questions about how society invests in social purpose for the common good in the 21st century, including the shifting roles that charities and nonprofits play. So part of this shift is the growing interest in and external pressure to collaborate, merge, or otherwise amalgamate operations. Are nonprofit amalgamations moving from the margins to the mainstream? So we're going to start the afternoon hearing from Angela Clark about the Trellis story. I'll take a few minutes after Angela to provide a brief outline of a framework we developed as a result of chronicling this journey. Following this, we will share perspectives on nonprofit mergers from a board volunteer, a funder, and a capacity builder. We'll learn about another recent amalgamation in a different context and at a different scale, with Aiden Athwal speaking about the union of making changes with Dress for Success Calgary. We'll then hear from Sarah Wonky about a nonprofit merger and amalgamation decision tool that Social Venture Partners has recently developed. And finally, Sarah Bateman will speak about the creation of CADA's new organizational structural change grant program. But first, over to you, Angela. And can I ask, yeah, the slides are up, that's great. So Angela, over to you.
Thanks, James. So when we started out on this journey in 2019, we found that there wasn't a lot of easily accessible information out there on nonprofit mergers that we could draw from. So very early on, we decided we wanted to be very transparent about our process of the merge and wanted to share our learnings with the community. So hopefully you will find this and the reports that are available really helpful. A very important early learning for us is that merging is really hard, it's not cheap, and you will need a lot of support. So one of our first steps back in 2019 was to go to specific donors, funders, and stakeholders to vet out this idea. Was it worth pursuing, and would they support it? Luckily, many and those who are listed here did, and we could have not come together without them. So for believing in this wild idea and for our ongoing partnership, we're very grateful. Next slide, please. So the idea of Trellis started back in the fall of 2019. And looking back, we can divide our journey into 3 phases: considering, planning, and integrating. Now, all 3 had really critical milestones within them and were essential to where we find ourselves today. Phase 1 was really all about the vision, so knowing why we came together. Us, the 2 different agencies, had to really determine what this meant for us as individuals, but then come together on a collective vision on how to move forward. Our early talks of merging, it's really easy to focus on financial implications, but these are kind of a given. By merging, you will 100% find savings. Some will be immediate and some will be down the road. And we definitely talked at length about through reducing duplication, streamlining services, we could reinvest all of those cost savings back into frontline service delivery. But these early conversations at the board and senior leadership levels quickly turned from financial and operational savings to our core driving question that we kept coming back to. How will this make a better and more sustainable impact for the children, youth, families, and communities that we serve? This was not going to be about becoming bigger. It had to be about becoming better. And this is where we kept and keep coming back to. If you're having these conversations and you find that everything is centered around cost savings, your merge may still be successful. But what's out there in the literature suggests that the financial can't be the driver. Mission and impact really has to stay front and center. So our merge committee, which was made up of board and senior leadership from both organizations, really used this time to work through the purpose and vision behind our merge and landed on this one big door idea. So lessening barriers and creating streamlined access to holistic wraparound services. And then once we aligned on that vision, we jumped into due diligence and planning. Like any merge, there's going to be concrete steps you need to go through. And there is a lot out there on some of those steps that you should go through and things to consider. So we engaged with external experts to complete a really thorough and legal financial due diligence process. And that's both a requirement, but also can help each agency validate the reasons for doing this and see that it's being done for the right reason and not as a financial or legal lifeline. And then we developed a really comprehensive work plan across 9 work streams to really set the foundation for how we were going to move forward. These work streams covered things like governance, program planning, operating model, HR, legal, communications, all the really fun stuff. And that was led by an internal staff member who met with the leads of each work stream every week for updates to identify barriers, resources that would be needed, and any of those interdependencies between work streams. What did you need to complete over here that was necessary before you could move on somewhere else? And as a nonprofit, we get really used to doing things off the side of our desks, but merging off the side of your desk is not ideal. So if you do have the ability to dedicate staff and resources to help drive these projects forward, that will go a long way. Now for us, this is all still pre-pandemic, if you can even remember that far back. And when we were doing these risk assessments, no one had global pandemic on their bingo card. And so when we entered this time, we did debate on whether to shelve this and put it idea until the whole thing blows over. But we decided not to wait, which looking back, we're glad for now because we're a year into the pandemic and the merge, and it was the right decision for us. And a big part of that was that at this point, all of it was really locked down and on a need to know basis. And we quickly recognized that to do this well, we needed to open it up, and mainly to our staff. There's a lot we wanted people to provide input on, and we wanted their perspective. So we announced our merge before we had our name or a lot of things figured out. But this allowed us to open up conversations and bring people into that decision-making process. And right before I pass it back to James, I want to share 2 key learnings from our integration. You will be in 3 organizations far longer than you expect. And the MRU team did a really great job of seeing this in their evaluation and representing in this graphic with the different colored vines that come together, they separate, they join up here and there, and then one day they just form something new. And you may not even have noticed when that happens, because that takes time. This comes through building collective history, stories, and being through experiences together. So finding ways to bring teams together through this is really critical as you work to build this shared organizational culture. This has definitely been the most impacted area for us through this merge by the pandemic, as most of our staff have never met in person, our board has never met in person, and all the resources out there on how to build culture through a merge doesn't really apply in this new day and age we find ourselves in. So you really have to get creative. And lastly, you need to know your plan, but be fully ready to adjust and adapt, especially with your timelines. In the first few months, we were running off of our feet trying to meet these deadlines, and staff weren't really happy with some of the interruptions that this was causing. So we took a step back and realized that most of these deadlines were really self-imposed. So where could we adjust based on progress and the feedback on that pace of change? If you keep coming back to this question of, is this making things better for the people that you're serving? You will also have to ask the question, is this making it better for your staff? So recognize when people need decisions to be made, but also when they need rest from constant change, and build in that time to celebrate not just the merge success, but the day-to-day work that doesn't stop just because you're merging. So that's just a few of our key learnings, and there's a lot more in this report. And again, just great thanks to the MRU team for really having interest in this project. And with that, I will pass it back to James.
Thanks, Angela. Next slide, please. So working with my amazing colleague and former MRU student, Cordelia Snowden, who will also be joining us in the Q&A today, we followed the Trellis merger as it unfolded, holding 43 in-depth conversations with 34 different stakeholders, including board members, management, staff, both frontline and back office, donors, consultants, and nonprofit merger veterans, people who've gone through this process before with other organizations. We spoke with stakeholders at 2 different intervals, very early on in the process, and then many months later. And we also reviewed and wove insights from both academic and non-academic literature, thin though it is. Organizational change usually happens behind closed doors because organizations want or are expected to present their best selves to the world. And the honest, in-the-moment reflections and storytelling from the Trellis conversations, participants allowed us to see all the pains and the gains of the merger and create a clearer picture that we hope will be of benefit to other organizations. So as such, this work sits somewhere between a case study and a developmental evaluation, which makes it unique. Most nonprofit merger guides are written by lawyers or accountants and focus on either regulatory or financial matters. So while the interim report, which we titled One Big Experiment, focused on chronicling the pre-Trellis journey, the plan from the beginning was to develop a framework to have far-reaching value to other nonprofits, funders, other capacity builders. And moreover, it's not just valuable to managers and boards. We really hope that it's a useful guide to frontline staff as it illuminates the complexities of a merger, yet speaks to some pretty grounded experiences around culture, operations, service delivery, and lived HR issues. Next slide. Moving on to the framework itself, we divided the framework into three main phases. So considering whether to merge, planning the components and sequencing of the merger, and integrating the programs and operations. We provide questions to consider in each phase and devote sections of the report to each of the topics listed on the middle of the slide. Next slide. The first stage, considering, is where the seed of the idea appears and where you start to devote resources to it. We've mapped out 10 go, no-go questions that organizations can work through to determine if an amalgamation may be right for them. The top three, being free from external coercion, being in the community's interest, and not being driven by financial pressure, are foundational. The driver for a merger must be authentically driven by mission and to community interest. Note also that mergers are not actually a great option for organizations that are already failing financially or otherwise. In fact, it is a myth that only organizations in precarious circumstances seriously consider mergers. Mergers are far more likely to happen when organizations are driven by innovation. So does your organization have an appetite for disruption? Does it have a learning culture? Does it have a proven track record of collaboration already? Some other questions are critical in this consideration phase. Is there a symmetry of purpose? You'll see later that Sarah Wonky and her team at SVP Calgary have developed a very helpful way of determining whether there is alignment of purpose. Also, is the question of leadership of the new organization clear? Or is it likely to be a contest between two or more current CEOs? Finally, support from funders, donors, other supporters is critical, as is financial capacity. Mergers are typically very expensive. Next slide. For the planning and integrating phases, the framework contains a general description of each theme area. Each are about 1 or 2 pages with a case study box which describes Trellis's experience. We don't have time to dive into these in any depth, but I'll simply review the areas covered. So we looked at values and culture, governance. Keep in mind, boards can and regularly do stop mergers dead in their tracks. HR, financial considerations, legal and regulatory considerations, branding and external communications. By the way, these last 3 areas are where you will most likely need outside support. The organization may have some experience and capacity to navigate these, but given the stakes and potential cost of errors, securing resources to fund consultants or external support is recommended. Next slide. Next, we address funder and donor stewardship, internal communication, frontline programs, and back office operations. Note that the 2 of those can sometimes be in tension. Finally, we cover space, social impact, client feedback, data research and development, public policy, and finding closure. It's really important, as Angela alluded to both celebrate and grieve the legacy organizations and their many accomplishments, unique cultures, and spirit. Next slide. So in addition to the framework itself, the Merging for Good report has other discrete sections exploring how we ought to go about evaluating mergers, noting also that nonprofits will never be more exposed or vulnerable as when undertaking a merger. The Boston-based merger observer and writer Thomas McLaughlin notes that while the cost of merger, including its failure, might be easily determined, the benefits are almost certain to be impossible to calculate. This is because the desired benefits are usually strategic and well into the future. So we've included as well a section for funders. Mergers aren't cheap. No organization will ever do this off the side of their desk. How can funders signal but not drive, leverage their own connections, build collective knowledge, embed appropriate flexibility and trust while lightening the enormous burden of paperwork and anxiety, and so on. There's also a section early on that explores the prospects for a widespread wave of nonprofit mergers in the post-COVID era. One thing that's pretty clear, if any wave of nonprofit mergers is to happen, it won't be until the pandemic is behind us. And then we finish with a section on taking your first steps, considering carefully, doing this not as a visionary CEO solo heroic project, but as something to socialize with your whole team. And that's why I hope it's not just executives on this webinar, but also staff and volunteers. We've also included an appendix of resources, guides, webinars, and training in the guide. So those taking this step you're gonna find yourself in deep, dark valleys of doubt and regret. You'll become absorbed with the details. How do you achieve payroll parity? How do we agree to develop a certain type of software? Whose do we adopt? What about giving up our lovely space? But remember, it will take a long time for most cultures to gel. And as long as you have that North Star authentically tied to what it is you do and why you do it, this will keep you going. Most nonprofit mergers have not only stood the test of time, but they have indeed helped to enhance service to the common good. Final slide, just information on how to download. You can also download it in the chat function, as you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen. But please feel free to visit our website, go to the publications tab and download it there. So I'm gonna next go to Aiden. And Aiden, if you could take us through the story of making changes and Dress for Success, the amalgamation there. And I'd be curious to know what resonates with the Merging for Good framework that I just described, as well as what is unique about your own experience and journey.
Sure, thank you so much, James. And firstly, I want to thank Angela and Trellis for being so transparent and open with your merger, as we used your experience as a major resource to help us through the process. The merger, or the amalgamation of Making Changes and Dress for Success Calgary, was in the making for close to 2 years, starting out as very informal, exploratory, preliminary discussions on the board level. And then in the second year, significant discussion and due diligence was completed, which unfortunately was during the pandemic. Dress for Success Calgary and Making Changes have coexisted in Calgary for several years with a very similar mandate and essentially a shared vision of a world where women are economically empowered. Both organizations had a program related to providing clothing attire to women in need, and our process was very similar. We worked with partner agencies like the Calgary Immigrant Women's Association and the YW, who would refer clients to us. And then we would provide one-on-one image consultations, and then provide them with a wardrobe for their professional, academic, or volunteer endeavors. Now, Dress for Success Calgary was a rather young charity in Calgary that was building momentum and brand recognition with the city. And Making Changes was a much larger establishment compared to Dress for Success, and was rooted in over 30 years of history in the city. Dress for Success Calgary was at a very pivotal spot where we were ripe for disruption and change. And we had built strong, like I said, strong momentum, but our programming remained more or less quite static. And we needed to start investing in our infrastructure, including our staff, obtaining additional space and technology to be able to offer more programs and create a lasting impact in the community. Making Changes was an established organization with a strong executive director, staff, extensive partnerships and agency networks, and overall a significantly stronger infrastructure than Dress for Success Calgary. At the same time, they were looking to refresh their brand and attract new interest, networks, and funding to their organization. So the combination of Making Changes' broad, established infrastructure and Dress for Success's worldwide brand, we're one of 145 affiliates, would really poise the new organizational structure to better advance the future of women together. So it was quite a complementary marriage of the two, and just simply made sense, in my opinion. But there was significant division on the board level, and the approval of the merger required for it to pass not only on the board level, but then on the volunteer level as they were members per our bylaws. So the board collectively decided that we may not have the appropriate expertise and objectivity to assess the opportunity effectively, and that it was in the best interest of the organization to bring in an objective, skilled third party to assess not only the strategic alliances, but Dress for Success Calgary as a whole and our options moving forward. So Boston Consulting Group graciously offered their services pro bono over the course of the summer of 2020 and did a thorough analysis of our organization and the merger. And ultimately, the data showed that together with making changes, we'd be able to create efficiencies in our program delivery, maximize the quality and range of services at a much more exponential speed rather than operating standalone, reduce costs, and ultimately increase the number of women served. And after the consulting engagement was complete, the merger was put to a vote to the board and it passed with a majority. It then went to our members, our volunteers, and it was unanimously approved and supported by them. We also received significant positive feedback and support from donors and the community, which was fantastic. We merged at the end of December 2020, and we've now integrated our staff, volunteers, board, and operations. We have representation of both board and volunteers, but merging in the pandemic has definitely had its own challenges. But now Dress for Success Calgary is now a division of Making Changes with its own advisory board in place, and it is now one of the largest affiliates in Canada, and we are projected to go from serving 400 women to over 2,000 women a year. And we plan to introduce new value-added programs to our clients in the next year. So that's kind of our story, and there's a lot that resonates with us, particularly having that objectivity from an external consultant. Merging in a pandemic is challenging for sure, but also at the end of the day, looking at this in a lens of the client. What is in the best interest of the client? Like Angela and James have mentioned, there is a lot of significant costs potentially of savings, but at the end of the day, it's what's in the best interest for our clients and for our community. And I think that's what we had to stay true to throughout our process.
Aiden, thank you. That's really amazing. And I'd love to dig in a little bit more about that client question if we have time later. By the way, I'm going to ask all of the audience participants on this call to start thinking of questions that you might have, and you can use the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen. There's a little question box that you'll be able to see on the right-hand side. So do start thinking about questions before we go to the two Sarahs. Sarah Wonky, you were also quite close to the Trellis merger, and in fact, from what I understand, the experience even helped you inspire your SVP team to create a decision-making tool for nonprofits. So tell us more about this tool, how it came to be, and how you anticipate it'll be used.
Thanks, James. Thank you for having us here. And I'll just take a minute just to explain a little bit about what Social Venture Partners does, because that helps with the context of the tool that we've developed. So we bring high-skilled volunteers from all walks of life, business executives, retirees, stay-at-home parents, young professionals, to an engaged philanthropy model. So SVP project manages teams of these volunteers to provide resources to nonprofits in Calgary, with our goal of facilitating curiosity, sitting alongside nonprofit organizations as a partner, and co-creating solutions and paths forward. In our focus on shorter-term, high-impact projects, we are developing key areas of specialization that we can bring to the nonprofit sector as add-on resources to the leadership and staff teams that are doing incredible work. One of these areas is strategic partnerships. And by bringing together these skilled volunteers who have experience in corporate development, strategic planning, financial sustainability, and more, and providing them with training in the needs of the nonprofit sector. We hope to be able to continue and build upon our valuable free resource to nonprofits as they consider their options in a time of sector transformation and consolidation. And the opportunity to partner with Trellis, then Boys and Girls Clubs of Calgary, when we started our partnership with them, we were really drawn to the early conversations about the one big door vision about amalgamation and consolidation in the sector. And as we start to take a step back and look more sector-wide in the work that we do, instead of just working with individual organizations, the conversation about consolidation, but the lack of resources available to organizations considering that as a strategic path forward became quite evident. And so it was a really great opportunity for us. We were working with Jeff Dyer, then the CEO of Boys and Girls Club, to validate the merger idea with private donors. And then we've been able to stay alongside throughout the merger and the post-merger integration process, and worked to develop an assessment rubric that we will use as a tool for navigating a potential merger with organizations in the nonprofit sector who are looking at it. So we've used the experience of Trellis, the excellent report that James and Cordelia did from the Institute of Community Prosperity, the two-part report, and we combined that with research from available literature, case studies of nonprofit mergers, mostly US-based, because there is not a lot available to us here in Canada, especially Alberta, to use. And we built a framework that our volunteer partners will use when working with organizations that are considering a merger. So the objective of this assessment rubric is to facilitate nonprofit partnerships in support of 5 main principles: creating a positive impact for those in need through improved services, increased scope of delivery, improving the future financial position of organizations through increased access to funding or streamlined cost structure, strengthening the value proposition to donors, supporters, and partners, combining organizations with complementary purpose, allowing them to maintain their commitment to their mission, and combining organizations with complementary strengths and weaknesses, leading to synergistic merge. And the assessment rubric, the framework itself, goes through the 7 stages of M&A, from merger thesis to partner integration. So it starts with the guiding questions of the merger thesis, evaluating strategic, cultural, operational fit through external screen, preliminary diligence, detailed diligence, and then into legal and audit coordination and deal execution, integration planning, and then post-merger integration. And all of this, I mean, without sharing the entire framework, I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but we have seen that this in itself, me talking about the 7 stages and the merger thesis and the process right through, can be very overwhelming. And, you know, as both Angela and I have said, they had external agencies come in. SVP is not looking to take the place of the legal or the accounting diligence. That still needs to be done by a third party, but we are hoping to play the role of that third party observer who walks you through the process. We think that by encouraging organizations that are considering a merger as part of their strategic planning, you know, if they contact us, we can act as a resource to explain the process. Our goal as a capacity building organization is to ensure that boards and leadership teams are aware of the process, the timelines, the critical success factors, and the key questions to ask of themselves and each other. Understanding upfront the issues that arise during the merger process and learning how these issues have been successfully resolved in other cases can be extremely helpful for those considering or engaged in a merger. So engaging in knowledge sharing between cross-sector from academic and research lens like we have here today, the donors, the funders, the capacity builders like ourselves, and of course the organization's leadership teams with expertise in learning is critical to enabling a culture of opportunity. We have to remember that thinking proactively about the future of an organization is sound stewardship and good strategic planning. And with a network of supports as we have here today, we hope that organizations feel empowered in their decision making. And we encourage them to just reach out, ask the questions, start the conversation. It doesn't mean that you're going to merge. It doesn't mean that it's the right fit for your organization, but having tools available and resources to ask the right questions, we think will enable a wave of opportunity here in Calgary.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And so we've been talking mostly about the human services organization context, but a lot of these lessons are probably transferable to other parts of the nonprofit sector, including arts and culture groups. So Sarah Bateman, I know that CADA has developed a new funding tool, and as a funding partner, as a capacity builder, tell us a bit more about how you're responding to the transition that organizations you work with are experiencing.
Sure, thanks, James. Thanks for inviting me here to share a little bit about what we're thinking about and how these conversations could play out in the arts. The COVID pandemic has brought to light an even more harsh perspective, what is working and not working in the nonprofit sector. And as the public arts funder for the City of Calgary, we saw stats and research that were not great for the survival of some arts organizations without continued grants and government support. So coming out of the first year of the COVID pandemic, Calgary Arts Development recognized that the sector shut down and all the health mandates had actually disproportionately impacted the arts sector. You know, they were the first to close that March 12th, and they're going to be the last to open. And that we knew that there was going to be some difficult conversations that had to take place among board members and organizations' leaderships in the months to come. You know, when your earned revenues dried up or in the best case scenario were limited, it's hard to see a future sometimes. So, but the good news is we started having conversations with the arts organizations last year, and some organizations were wanting to look at different models like mergers, amalgamations, hibernations, and even possibly closures. But the reality is it takes resources, as many of the other panelists have talked about. Last year, the National Access Arts Center, formerly Indefinite Arts, merged with Momo Arts and Artistic Expressions. And they came to Calgary Arts Development for funding. And I didn't have a grants program that fit. I was trying to figure out how to support that. But I did see a need for funders to be able to have pots of money to support different and changing organization models like these mergers, and maybe even closures, because closures also take a great deal of resources. It's not just about closing the door. Well, we were able to end up finding some money for the National Arts Center mergers. I realized that this coming year, 2021, would need to have a dedicated fund to support different structural changes for organizations. So we introduced a grant called the Organization Structural Change Grant. I probably would change the name now in hindsight, but we're going with that for the rest of the year. The pandemic does provide this opportunity for boards to consider these changes. I think what people have talked about, it's not just financial, and it shouldn't be the driving reason, but it should also be about their place in the ecosystem. What do they provide to the arts sector, to citizens of Calgary? And could this grant, the Organization Structural Change Grant, help support those decisions of organizations coming together to really strengthen their value proposition or what they do for their communities and their audiences? You know, boards often are supposed to just look at the risks, and I would say that they need to shift also to the opportunities that these mergers can bring to the sector and to their audiences. So as we were looking at this, our research indicated that there was going to be a handful, there probably should be a handful of arts organizations that wouldn't be financially viable due to loss of revenue or the limited ability to adapt, or I think one of the panelists talked about it was time for disruption. And so, you know, how do we support them as a funder? And that's really was the driving force behind the creation of this grant. We developed the grant with some principles. We wanted to help art-centered nonprofits in Calgary be prepared and be supported through possible structural changes like mergers, amalgamations, and possibly closures. If we wanted to be able to hospice with care any closures, and I think also that it wasn't until one of the panelists talked about the grief of letting go of what the organizations were in mergers too. I think that applies in this case too. And then the other piece, the other principle was we wanted to ensure the contributions of the previous organizations are acknowledged and preserved, regardless if it's a merger or closure. I think it's really important to celebrate the contributions of those organizations. I wish I had seen the Trellis framework. I don't think it came out till after I had designed the grant, but your considering, planning, and integrating phases are very similar to the 3 phases of the grants that I have available. I call them exploration, expertise, and execution, following kind of similar timelines for that. But one of the benefits of this grant is it has really allowed for a different conversation, an open conversation with these arts organizations that are wanting to explore other structures and perhaps even closures. So, you know, the questions we're holding and talking about is, how do we not view mergers, closures, any of these changes to a structure of an organization, not as a failure, but as an opportunity to celebrate and retain the contribution of these organizations to our city. This narrative shift is necessary, I think, to be able to really add value to our community, to the audiences, and really strengthen the organizations in what they're offering and how they're engaging. It's interesting, when I start my conversations with organizations reaching out, I'll first say, hey, everything we're going to be talking about is confidential, because, and you can just see the relief, because I think there's still a lot that's happening where there's not a positive narrative to help these organizations and protect them from potential ramifications and rumors when they're just starting to explore the idea of a merger, amalgamation, or even closure. So as funders, I think we need to support organizations that are interested in pursuing these different models. It does take, as was mentioned, incredible resources, time, support, and they should be able to do that without the fear of repercussions to their funding. The question we need to ask as funders is, what is our role in these conversations about mergers, not pushing them, but supporting them? And how can we play a part in changing the narratives towards an idea of strength and celebration, and not one from a negative narrative? So. And finally, as part of this grant, we are doing research, as there's not a lot of funder programs like this as well. So as Mount Royal has done the research from the organizational perspective, we're also doing developmental evaluation on the funder perspective here and what we're learning. So we'll be sure to share our process and outcomes as we do this kind of one size fits one approach to granting with empathy and curiosity. So stay tuned as we learn from this process.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for such amazing insights. And this is really, you know, you all have learning cultures. This is very contemporary stuff, learning by doing. It's totally fascinating. And we do have a few questions coming in. I think the first I'll maybe direct Aiden's way. You mentioned that there was a ripe for disruption kind of ecosystem signal with Dress for Success. Can you describe like what the indicators were? Like how do you know that you're ripe for disruption? What does that look like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it was just the life cycle of the charity. So just to give you some background, I think Dress for Success Calgary began in 2011. And around 2015, we almost closed our doors for a variety of reasons. We lacked the funding. Also, we were directly competing with Making Changes and offering a very, very similar service. With the help of volunteers, we were able to, stabilize the organization. And then around 2020, 2019, we were stabilized to a certain degree, but we knew we needed to pivot and that we needed to grow our organization substantially to be able to have a larger stamp in the community and to actually, better serve our clients. And it was at that point that we recognized that we could either go one way, which is stand alone and build that infrastructure very similarly to the way that Making Changes did. It would be literally following the same roadmap, differentiate our services, and because we are one of 145 affiliates, there was a certain boundary of where we could go in terms of the types of services that we provide, or consider strategic alliances. And because we were kind of a young organization, we also had quite an entrepreneurial spirit. That was just the nature of our board and our volunteers and our organization. So we were much more open to considering innovative, non-conventional paths forward.
For Sarah Wonky, just a couple of questions. I think one is pretty straightforward. When, if at all, would SVP's framework be available for us to reference? And then the second one is, I'm going to put it to you. It's not specifically to anyone, but I will put it to you, which is, can you give us a little insight as to how you find the right merger partner, the dating process, I guess? How do you do that? How do you narrow the broad search down to that perfect dance partner?
Thank you. Well, to answer the first question, we've talked about, do we just put the framework on our website, the assessment rubric, and make it available to everybody? We think that it needs some experiential expertise alongside with it. I think on its own, it would be a bit intimidating, and a lot of the elements of it need explaining. So any organization that's at any stage of the consideration of merger as a strategic path forward should just contact us, and we can set up just a one-on-one, walk you through the framework. The goal is that initially it's just our role. We would just explain to you what the process looks like, start to finish, the kind of questions that you're going to ask, the kind of information you're going to need to bring to the table, and what the other organization will as well. And then we'd like to partner along the path and help as these questions surface. And the second question, James, was about the evaluation of like the dating, the early stages in terms of finding an organization. I think we've heard this several times already today, that it all comes back to mission. And so as an organization is doing a strategic evaluation of what they do and how they do it, they need to themselves be asking what best advances the long-term mission of our organization, and then look, who are we already partnering with? What are the relationships we have with those organizations? Who are we not partnering with, but we admire what they're doing, or the culture that they have when they approach the problem that they're looking to solve? And if at every stage of the game, is this decision, is this path that we're looking to go down better for the people that we serve and the clients, and is it in alignment with our mission and our vision moving forward, then start those conversations. It also allows an organization individually to step back at a sector level to understand the greater ecosystem and the role they themselves play. And we heard this from Aiden, right? This is who's doing what we're doing, how similar is it? Is there an opportunity for divergence or consolidation? And I think that's the starting point, is to look who you're already partnering with, and then start those conversations and just be open and clear about what it is that you want to do, your mission, and who would be a good partner for you moving forward.
That's great. There's a really interesting question here that I'm going to put to Sarah, because you're the funder, but anyone else feel free to jump in. And it's, are you familiar with any example where a funder has merged with a non-funding organization?
I don't know of that.
I thought of one example. The Caledon Institute, which used to be a kind of a public policy think tank, a social policy think tank, which was created by the philanthropist Alan Broadbent once upon a time. He also birthed the Maytree Foundation, which was explicitly a grant-making foundation. The two organizations merged some time ago, I'm going to say about 10, 12 years ago, and became just Maytree together. So they kind of brought the policy wing into the foundation. That's the only example I can think of off the top of my head, though.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's impossible, because it depends on the objects of a funder, what under CRA or whatever structure they're under that they can do, because a number of funders actually do have, I want to say, like programs or capacity building or different pieces like that. So I think if there is, an organization that does complement their mission as a funder, or vice versa, it might, I don't think it's beyond the scope of possibility, for sure, like you were saying. I see a lot of funders going into some of that, or creating programming in some ways that does support the sectors. So yeah, that would be, I don't think it's an impossibility. It'd be an interesting case study for sure.
So there's a question here about grieving, the need to grieve, and I mentioned it, Angela mentioned it. The question is, though, do you see a founder's syndrome as being a barrier to considering a decision such as amalgamation, like that emotional deep attachment to the organization preventing amalgamation from happening? And I don't know, I mean, Angela, you may have thoughts on this, or anyone else. I think anyone could probably take this one.
Yeah, I can take a stab at that one. It's a really good question, because I think we've all seen that in the sector. We've all experienced that. I know we were coming from a place of kind of two different founder-ish type syndromes. We have Boys and Girls Clubs of Calgary, been around for a very long time, part of a larger organization, and people that really believed in that name and that brand and had the tattoo of the Jacks on their body. And so there was a bit of a founder mentality with a lot of the staff throughout the years. So that's a piece you have to acknowledge and recognize and be able to provide opportunities for people to process that and work through that and see that the work that they love isn't changing. The services that they love to provide is still there, it's just under a different name. So same great service, different name. But then on the flip side, we had Aspen had a really long-standing CEO who had been around for a very long time and had staff that had been there for 20 plus years, and that was on both sides. So you can have a bit of that founder mentality across the organization. And I think that's what is really important, is when you have the learning culture that's attached to that. You can have a founder mentality, you can have long-standing staff, but if they're committed to ongoing growth, transformation, and learning, it won't be a barrier to being able to do these types of things well and with boldness. If you are attached to the past and you're very ingrained in the old ways of doing things, merging is probably not going to be something you're even going to think about, because it's too different, it's too outside, and would create too much disruption for the norms that you're used to. So if you are invested in transformation and ongoing learning, merging will most likely be something that you do consider at one time or another. Both of our legacy CEOs had considered it previously, years ago, in different organizations and in different situations. So it will come up if that's something you're invested in. But it is really important to also just provide space and acknowledgement that this is a loss. You are losing. You went to this organization for a reason, and now, really, without any choice on your part, you're being pushed into this new organization that maybe you didn't choose. So how do you create that culture and invite staff into that and create an environment that staff want to be part of that? Because they see their histories reflected in it, but then they also see the vision for how they're going to move forward and how to get excited about that.
I might, Cordelia, I don't know if you're able to unmute and show yourself, reveal yourself, but you really had some awesome reflections on grieving, and both grieving and celebrating, the two sides of the same coin. Anything to add on this point?
Yes, well, first of all, thanks for bringing me on, and this has been so educational and insightful. I really appreciate listening to the panelists, so thank you all for sharing your stories. On grieving, I think my background is in social work, so this was something that was really interesting to me throughout the process, was making space to acknowledge the loss and the significance of it. And what we found, both from some of the staff, but also from the literature, is leaning into the theories that you already use as a nonprofit or a human serving organization. There might be this pressure, either actual or just perceived, to use some of the jargon or the theories or kind of the subjective approach that tends to work better in for-profits. But you're already using amazing frameworks like trauma-informed, client-centered, anti-oppressive practices in your organizations, and use those in your approach to the merger. So even if everything else in the merger is a learning curve, fall back on those theories that you're already using anytime you come up to challenges, and really you can't go wrong if those are the philosophies that you're constantly using as your North Star. So I think that's all I'd add on that point, but amazing reflection so far.
Oh, that's great, thank you. Here's a question for Sarah Bateman. Are you aware of any other grants similar to your OSC grant that would be accessible for organizations outside Calgary and relocating to Calgary under a partnership arrangement? So in this case, one is a Canada not-for-profit, Canadian not-for-profit, the other an Alberta Society. Both are charities in the arts and culture space.
What we're finding is there's not very many very specific grant programs for these types of conversations of mergers, amalgamations, period. And actually a number of funders, even outside of the arts, have reached out to us, and they really want to know how this goes, because I think they see the need to do it, but there's also this risk thought from a funder's perspective. Am I funding something that might not work, risk stuff. Sometimes funders are their own worst enemy too. So, I was really interested in the funders that did support the Trellis merger, and, but probably one-on-one, probably not a specific grant program, So I do think you'll probably start to see this a little bit more, but I don't know of anybody else right now that is offering it. But what I would say is, talk to your community foundations, talk to some of those larger kind of community-wide funders, because they're having these conversations. They just might not have the program available, published, but they may be open to supporting and learning from it as well. So that would be my suggestion there.
Great. We have a spicy question that I'm going to put to Aiden, but I would invite Angela as well to chime in, and maybe Cordelia. And that is, did you have any employee disputes through your process? And if yes, can you elaborate on that?
Thankfully, we did not actually. So what happened was Dress for Success Calgary had one employee at the time, and as part of the merger, it was very important for us to ensure her employment. And so she came in as the program manager, or one of the two program managers of Dress for Success Calgary, and the staffing on making changes and remain the same as well. So thankfully and fortunately, we were able to accommodate our small but mighty staff.
Great. Angela or Cordelia, any thoughts?
There was no line brawls, if that is what we're talking about. But there was definitely conflict, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think when we look at how we bring people together, often that's formed through working through conflict. And so early days, when our executive and our board got together, we had to all really work to shelve our egos and say what's best for this organization going forward. And maybe that isn't us. Maybe that's not me. Maybe I don't have a seat at that table. But if we believe in the vision and we know that this is the best thing for the people we're serving, then we have to take ourselves out of it. So that was something I always had to come back to. And then those one-off things where you have, two programs coming together, people have their own ways of documenting case notes that they're really tied to, or they have their database that they love. I don't know if everyone loves databases, but a lot of people do. Or if there's little pieces that people really are invested in, you have to be able to wrestle through it and say, why did we like this previously? What worked, what didn't, and what do we need going forward? So being willing to let go of the past and wrestle through that. And some of those conflicts, disputes probably weren't pretty at the time, but if we look back at them, they were probably where the most rich learning experiences came out of, because they forced us to ask deep questions, which then led to solving other problems we didn't even know were there. So disputes aren't bad, and as long as you're willing to work through them and try to leave your ego where you can, they're really rich.
Great. So we're actually getting close to the hour, so I'm going to hand things over to Karen. Thank you all, Sarah, Cordelia, Aiden, and Angela, for just a really rich discussion. And we're just getting started on this topic, I'm sure. Karen.
Thanks, James, and thank you again to the amazing panel. Wow, what a great conversation. It's been such a pleasure to learn from your experience and expertise around this important topic. And thank you for your commitment to learning and to transparency. It's really amazing. And while I'm thanking people, I will thank once again our presenting sponsor, ATB Financial, and the Mount Royal Institute for Community Prosperity for this session, as well as to our supporters, the Motart Foundation, PwC Canada, and our media partner, Postmedia. We're thrilled to announce that the Connections Conference is back for 2021, so please save the date, November 9th and 10th, 2021. And thank you again to everyone who attended today and for all that you do every day. To our panelists and supporters, I want to give a shout out to the CCVO team also, Marissa Barber, Mary Polychronis, and Maro Yosefashi for all your work behind the scenes today. Please take a moment to complete our short survey that you'll see pop up after. And in case you don't get a chance to share your feedback today, check your inbox for the survey and links to great reads and more information on today's topic provided by our moderator and panelists. So thanks once again. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and we hope you can join us again soon.